Good morning and welcome. This is the Sunday morning sermon for October 30th, 2022 for Black Rock Baptist Church, and we've been working our way through the book of Daniel. We're into number 5 and chapter 5 of the book. This morning we're going to look at the handwriting on the wall. Kind of a bit of a spooky experience, maybe appropriate as we have Halloween tomorrow, but we're going to look at chapter 5 and try to explain some of the very strange happenings that occur there. Okay, it's another 30 years that have passed since the end of chapter 4, and Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 finally loses his pride. He gave up his worship of the false gods and he committed to serve and praise the one true God. He ruled 7 more years after that, after he made that all-important decision. So basic math tells us that it's been 23 years since Nebuchadnezzar has died. And unfortunately, his religious reforms die with him. Nebuchadnezzar's son succeeded him. He only reigned about 2 years before his power-hungry brother-in-law assassinated him and stole the crown. After another 6-year reign, he died, and his son stepped into power. His rule lasted only a few months before he was murdered in a coup led by Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, Nabonidus, who spent most of his reign away from the city of Babylon, attempting to secure the borders, strengthening the empire, and so he appointed his son Belshazzar to be a kind of a co-ruler. And he left him in charge of the famous doubled wall city, capital city of Babylon. Unfortunately, Belshazzar received none of the benefits of his grandfather's hard-earned spiritual truths. In fact, about the only trait that he picked up from Nebuchadnezzar was Nebuchadnezzar's discarded pride. And because of that, his heart is not all that responsive to the Spirit of God. In any case, as the 5th chapter opens, the empire of the Persians and the Medes, the silver empire that was told about in Nebuchadnezzar's first dream some 6 decades earlier, that empire is growing in power. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that in an attempt to end this threat to his kingdom once and for all, King Nabonidus took the armies of Babylon out and he fought against Darius, the king of the Persians. Nabonidus was defeated and fled. So Darius and his armies advance. They capture every outpost until they reach the city of Babylon, and that's all that remained. They arrived and they laid siege to the city. But Belshazzar thinks, well, you know, who's afraid of the big bad Persians? I've got plenty of water. The Euphrates River flows right through the town here. And I've got tons of grain stored up. In fact, I've got enough to feed the population for 20 years, so we can just sit in here and wait them out. Now, that wasn't a foolish thought, really. Because, after all, everyone in this city thought that the city was unconquerable. Remember the size of its walls and the fortifications that we talked about a few weeks ago. Well, maybe Belshazzar shouldn't have been so proud and so confident of those fortifications. He should have embraced the truth in the stories of his grandfather, the stories his grandfather must have told him. Because as Daniel chapter 2, verse 21 says, once again, God changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and disposes of them. As we'll see when we get a little further into chapter 5, Belshazzar's grandfather's experiences with God were well known. So Belshazzar knew about his grandfather's dream and Daniel's interpretation of that dream. He had been warned of the coming silver kingdom that God had said was going to destroy the empire. He had no doubt heard Nebuchadnezzar share his personal testimony of his decision to humble himself and worship the one true God, a lesson he had learned the hard way by living like an animal for many years. But Belshazzar and his predecessors had foolishly ignored all that God-given knowledge. They had refused to bow the knee to the one and only true God. By the way, I think our study of this book should remind us as well. I mean, the main truth that the book of Daniel was intended to convey is that Daniel's God is the one true God, the sovereign God. He's God, not you, not me, not the government. God is in charge. As Psalm 33 verses 10 and 11 tells us, the Lord foils the plans of nations. He thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purpose of his heart through all generations. Well, to both show his lack of fear of the armies that were encamped around them, and also to boast the morale of his government and his people, Belshazzar throws a party. It's a huge party. He invited 1,000 nobles, and they broke protocol by telling all of these people to bring their wives and concubines along with them. Archaeologists tell us they've pinpointed that this party was held on the night of October the 12th, 539 BC. They've also unearthed the banquet hall where the party was held. Follow along as I read verses 1 through 4, and as you do follow along here, take note of the verb. A verb that's repeated 5 times here that tells us the theme or the purpose of Belshazzar's little get-together. Let's go. Verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles and his wives and concubines could drink from them. So they brought the golden goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, they drank from them. And as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron, wood and stone. Okay, did you see that repeated verb? It's the verb drink. And that was the main activity of October the 12th, 539 BC in this huge banquet room. But that's not all they did. You see, it was considered improper for women to come to banquets. So the fact that the wives and the concubines were also invited tells us hunger and thirst weren't the only appetites that this banquet was intended to satisfy. In fact, it was more of an orgy than a banquet. I mean, the writer, Daniel, is using fairly restrained language here, but he's making it very clear that Belshazzar is giving free rein to any appetite that his guests want to indulge in, with him setting the note setting the tone with his own perverse behavior at the head table. Well, since Habitually indulging any appetite gets boring after a little while. Belshazzar and his guests got tired of their orgy, and so he decided to push the envelope a little further and get a little bit more bold. This should remind us of a very important fact, and that is that sin is never static. It always follows the law of diminishing returns. The pathway of sin always leads downhill. One sin leads to another, which leads to an even worse sin, and so on. I think this downward spiral is what James was referring to when James wrote, "Each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death." We see this downward spiral in verse 2 when Belshazzar gives orders to get those goblets that Nebuchadnezzar had obtained 65 years earlier when he conquered Jerusalem. They were abnormally valuable goblets, and more than that, they were considered sacred objects. They had never been used for anything other than the worship of the God of Israel, the God that we worship today. Well, Belshazzar decides that it would be kind of entertaining. It might even be a little bit to take the boredom factor away if we could take these goblets and use them to mock these people's warnings of the coming silver kingdom, a kingdom that was supposedly conquer mighty Babylon. Understand, no other king has ever had the audacity to use these holy vessels, but Belshazzar did. His heart, a proud heart that had long since hardened against God, led him to make this very serious mistake of treating the holy as unholy. Now, let's pause for a moment so we can understand exactly what we mean by calling something holy. The word literally means that it's been set apart for a special purpose. 2 Chronicles 7:16 tells us that God himself had consecrated Solomon's temple and everything in it, which included these goblets. He declared it all to be holy. He had said they were set aside exclusively for his purposes. These weren't just any goblets, these belonged to God, and they were to be used only for worship in his temple. Now, Belshazzar knew better. He knew these were God's goblets. He knew it was wrong to use them. In fact, that's why he wanted to use them. He thought it would be fun to take something of God's, something set apart for his worship, take something holy and treat it as unholy. Well, in my mind, as soon as the goblets were distributed, Belshazzar calls for some kind of a toast, perhaps a toast to the impregnable walls of the city of Babylon. And then as soon as he and his guests brought those holy vessels to their unholy lips for the very first time, something amazing happens here. A hand appears in midair, and a finger from that hand begins to write on the wall. This was God's hand. Think about that. We have heard of the unseen hand of God, but with their own eyes, Belshazzar and his guests, well, they've now seen the hand of God. Look at verses 5 and 6. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. I think this shows that nothing sobers somebody up like a crisis. I mean, fear has a way of negating the effects of too much alcohol, too much wine. And God's holy hand can be a very fearful thing. Belshazzar was understandably terrified. Daniel tells us that his knees literally knocked together at this point, and history repeated itself for the third time. For the third time, a Babylonian ruler called on his wise men to interpret something. And for the third time, they fail in the task. And for the third time, Daniel is going to get called in. Now, Belshazzar didn't really know Daniel very well. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure that he had heard about Daniel, but long ago he had pushed that name out of his mind. So when his wise men failed to interpret the words God had written on the wall, Belshazzar and his nobles continued to cry out and moan in fear. In fact, their cries were so loud that they were heard by Necritus, the last surviving wife of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar's grandmother. She hears it. Think of this lady as the elderly queen mother of Babylon. The elderly queen would have known a lot about Daniel's skill. After all, she had seen and heard all the events of chapters 1 through 4. Perhaps she was even a friend of Daniel. She may have even been a God follower like her husband. In my mind, she was. And she had refused to degrade herself by attending the banquet. In any case, she knew Daniel's qualifications. And she told her grandson to call upon him. She said, "Get Daniel." Look at verses 10 through 16. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your grandfather, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar appointed him chief of the magicians, the astrologers, and diviners. This man, Daniel, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and to tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made third highest ruler in the kingdom." Note, Belshazzar could only offer Daniel the third highest place in the kingdom because he was the second highest. Remember, his father was number one. Now, by this time, Daniel is in his 80s. It has been decades since Daniel has been called upon to advise the king. He was probably living in some sort of Babylonian retirement home, and I imagine his hair is gray. He's a little bit frail. In any case, after decades of retirement, this discarded old prophet is once again brought forward to advise a Babylonian ruler as he surveys the banquet hall and sees what's going on. He sees the scantily clad women. He sees the behavioral results of wine that flowed like the Euphrates River itself. And then his eyes land on those goblets. the holy vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. He probably hasn't seen those goblets since he was a boy, but he knows what they are. He knows their purpose. He knows that God has set them apart for a holy purpose. And so in disgust, he says, basically, this is John HANNEM interpretation, okay, I'll interpret the writing, but you can keep your gifts. You can't buy your way out of your sin, Belshazzar. God's judgment is coming, and all of the gold in your treasury is not going to stop it. Look at verses 18 through 31 of chapter 5 here. Daniel says, O King, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of his high position, he gave him all the peoples and nations and men of every language. They dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted, and those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was removed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived in the wild with donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged the Most High God as sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets them over anyone he wishes. But you, his grandson, O Belshazzar, you have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from the temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, you drank from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, and of bronze and iron, wood and stone, which cannot see, hear, or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent this hand to write the inscription. This is the inscription he has written: Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is what the words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Pers, your kingdom is divided and given to the Persians and the Mede. Now let's review what has happened. Daniel reminded Belshazzar of what pride had cost his grandfather. He reminded him of Nebuchadnezzar's animal years. And in his decision to worship the one true God, to finally give up his pride. So Daniel also reminded Belshazzar that this was not news to him. He knew all about this, but in pride he had ignored all of this. He had chosen to show disrespect, to dishonor the Most High God. Listen again to Daniel's words. Daniel says, You, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, even though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up as the Lord of heaven. This is one of the most arresting phrases in Scripture. And Daniel says it to Belshazzar. He says, you knew. I mean, it's bad enough that Belshazzar did the wicked things that he did, but what made it even worse was that he knew better. I mean, he had no excuse. God had given him a front row seat to all that had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar knew all about the dreams and their interpretations. He knew all about the fiery furnace incident. He had heard his grandfather's testimony. He knew who the true God was. And he demanded that he still get his own way. He'd do his own thing. You know, before you judge Belshazzar, let's admit it. You and I do the same thing. We sin the same way. We avoid the responsibility of knowing the truth because we do what we want to do. I mean, you know, those speed traps out there on the highway, I hate them as much as you do. But let's be honest, we know what the speed limit is. But we ignore it because we want to move faster. We want to get places, do things. That's only a minor example of the way we repeat Belshazzar's sin. We have the Bible. We have God's Spirit living within us. We know better. But we still sin in commission and omission every day. We do what we want to do, and we don't do what we don't want to do all the time. We avoid thinking about, reading about, talking about, dwelling on, looking at that which might convict us of sin, that might cause us pain, or call us to change our lives. Think about it. Is there an area of your life where you know better, but you just keep closing your eyes? There may be someone this morning who's not a Christian, and you need to know Jesus. A friend or a family member has shared the gospel with you, perhaps repeatedly. So you know you should ask Jesus into your life and into your heart. But you know what that would mean, so you don't do it. You resist God's love. If you are convicted in any way by this part of the text of the book of Daniel, don't close your eyes. Don't pull a Belshazzar. Don't ignore what you know. Humble yourself before God and follow his leading. Remember, God has given us free will, so we are responsible to act upon what we know. Well, Belshazzar seems unmoved by Daniel's admonishing. He even insists on giving Daniel his reward. And he put a purple robe on his shoulders and gold chains around his neck. He honored Daniel, but he would not honor Daniel's God. He went right back to doing what he had done before, blind to the fact that, to use another cliche, the party was over. One of the greatest empires in existence was to crumble in a single night. You see, for 2 years now, the army of the Persians and the Mede, they had had their workers working upstream, digging a canal to change the course, the flow of the river, dumping the water into a swamp. And on this night, that little canal was finally finished. They opened its gates, and the water level of the Euphrates dropped such that the troops could easily march into the city under the gates. They literally marched right into the city. The Babylonians surrendered without a fight, and the only one killed was Belshazzar himself. All the others were spared, which explains how Daniel lived to serve God another day. Now, before we close, I want to point out a very important fact. You see, there's another way that you and I are like Belshazzar, and here it is. Every one of us have been weighed in the scales and found to be wanting. If we were to somehow put our lives on one side of the scales of righteousness, none of us would come up to God's holy standard. Romans 3:23 tells us that all have sinned, they've all fallen short of the glory of God. None of us measure up. Romans 3:10 and following gets even more specific. when it says there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who does good, not even one. So we have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. All of us have sinned. We sin every day. All of us fall short, not just in simple ways, but in many different ways. All of us ignore God. All of us disobey God. God could write on the wall of my life and your life, Tekel. You have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. And because that's true, if it weren't for Jesus, we would be horribly lost. But Jesus came, just as Daniel prophesied. To use another cliche, he came to give us a clean slate. He came to die on the cross for us, and in doing so, to wash away our sins. Colossians 2:4 puts it this way: Jesus forgave us all our sins, having blotted out all the ways we broke God's law, and he took it to nailing it to the cross. Aren't you glad Jesus did that? Aren't you thankful for the blood of Christ that cleanses us from all sin? The blood that washes away every sin? Well, join us again as we continue on in the book of Daniel and look at chapter 6 next, and as we continue and learn from Daniel's life. We pray, Lord, that the Lord would continue to speak to our hearts. Let's continue to exchange prayers daily. Have a wonderful day.